M. E. Nadenov. Revolution of 1905–1907, the First People's Revolution of the Era of Imperialism. Ist. Knowledge, Moscow, 1955. OCR, BIOGRAFIA.RU. Prerequisites of the People's Revolution in Russia. This year the Soviet people and all progressive humanity celebrate a significant anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the First Russian Revolution, which inscribed one of the brightest pages in the world history rich in revolutionary events. The revolution of 1905–1907 shook to the ground the dilapidated autocratic system, advanced far ahead the cause of social and national liberation of the working people of our country. At the same time, it gave a powerful impetus to the revolutionary movement in the countries of Western Europe and the national liberation movement of the colonial peoples. The revolution of 1905–1907 played such an important historical role because it was the first people's revolution of the era of imperialism. Although Russia later entered the path of capitalism later than other countries, however, in the last third of the 19th century capitalism developed so rapidly in it that by the beginning of the 20th century it had reached, as in other countries, the highest stage of its development, imperialism. The dominance of the monopolies, the merger of bank capital with the industrial one, the emergence of a financial oligarchy, the export of capital along with the export of goods, the formation of international monopolies, the completion of the territorial division of the world, Lenin noted as the main signs of imperialism. At the highest stage of its development, capitalism finally loses all its progressive features. From blooming, it turns into capitalism decaying and dying. Imperialism is the last stage of capitalism, when all the necessary prerequisites for the replacement of the capitalist mode of production by the socialist are being formed. Imperialism is the eve of the socialist revolution. At the beginning of the 20th century, all the most significant signs of imperialism existed in the Russian economy. In terms of the degree of concentration of production, Russian industry stood first in the world. In Russia, such powerful syndicates as Pradat, Produgal, Prodvagon, etc., have already appeared and every year more prominent in the economic life of the country. They captured almost all the sales of ferrous metal, coal, commodity and passenger wagons. Russian and foreign banks became full owners of entire industries. Along with these common features characteristic of the imperialism of any capitalist country, Russian imperialism had its own specific features, conditioned by the peculiarities of Russia's historical development. In Russia, unlike many Western European countries, the epoch of capitalism did not follow the victorious bourgeois revolution, but after the notorious peasant reform, carried out in 1861 by the Tsarist government. This reform did not destroy and could not destroy until the end of feudal production relations, long ago already turned into a brake on the development of productive forces. The aggravation of the antagonism between the capitalist productive forces and the remnants of feudal production relations was the main content of the entire post-reform economic development of Russia. Without a comprehensive consideration of this circumstance, one cannot understand either the causes, the character, or the uniqueness of the First Russian Revolution. Among the remnants of serfdom, the landlord's latifundia, the Tsarist autocracy and the class system played an especially large reactionary role. The reform of 1861 retained almost completely the monopoly ownership of landowners on land. The law declared them the owners of not only those lands that before the reform constituted the so-called lordly barrel, but also peasant plots, watered with blood and then many generations of serfs. On this basis, the landlords, already under the peasants' very freedom from serfdom, cut off from the peasant allotments over 5 million desiatin of the best land, pushing the peasants to the sand. And for that part of the allotment land that was left behind by the peasants, the state gave the landowners a monetary reward in an amount considerably exceeding its market value, while at the same time obliging the peasants to deposit in the treasury the entire amount of compensation received by the landowners. plus usury interest. Until 1907, only former privately owned peasants contributed to the treasury so-called redemption payments worth more than 1.5 billion rubles in gold. The amount of redemption payments paid to the treasury by all ranks of the peasantry exceeded 3.4 billion rubles in gold. These payments, in essence, were the same medieval quit rent that the feudal lords were exacting from the peasants under serfdom. Thus, the abolition of serfdom brought enormous money to the landlords, while retaining at the same time a monopoly ownership of land. According to official data, in 1905, 30,000 landlords held in their hands more than 70 million acres of land, that is, almost as much as was in use of 10 million peasant households. If on average there were 7 desiatines of land per peasant household, each of the 30,000 landowners owned an average of 2,300 acres of land, and the 700 largest landowners held an average of 30,000 acres of land each. Huge latifundia allowed landowners and in the era of capitalism to maintain feudal forms of exploitation of the peasantry. To this end, they used cuts particularly widely. Cut off from peasant land allotments were not only the best in quality, but also so important for the peasants that the latter, already in the disengagement of landed estates and peasants' lands in the 60s of the last century, were forced to enter into transactions with landowners, pledging to use, cut off the landowner's economy a certain number of days with his inventory and working cattle. Subsequently, this type of work, which in fact did not differ in any way from corvée, was extremely widespread. Along with workings, the landlords also widely used such forms of feudal exploitation of the peasants as bonded rent, use of land, etc. The concentration in the hands of the landlords of huge landed estates was the decisive cause of that acute shortage of land, which was the lot of tens of millions of peasants and which forced them to go into bondage to the landlords. Large land ownership was the material basis of numerous remnants of serfdom, including the Tsarist autocracy. Tsarism was the personification of the political domination of serf owners, owners of huge latifundia, and a handful of tycoons of financial capital. Through taxes and all kinds of state duties, which fell heavily on the shoulders of workers and peasants, Tsarism sucked out of the people all of its vital juices. Mercilessly cracking down on the dissatisfied, Tsarism turned Russia into a police torture chamber. In carrying out the forced Russification, the policy of national humiliation of non-Russian peoples, setting them against one another, flagrantly trampling their national culture, Tsarism turned Russia into a people's prison. Subordinating all its domestic and foreign policies to the class interests of noble landlords, Tsarism diligently preserved the remnants of serfdom in all spheres of public life. Particular care was taken by landlords and landowners. Dividing the population into medieval estates, Tsarism aspired to draw the sharpest possible line between the working people, the backbone, and the noblemen landlords, blue blood. Only the ruling classes enjoyed political rights, only before them were the doors of higher educational institutions, military schools, and state institutions widely opened. Belonging to the nobility, played a decisive role in appointing to this or that post in the state apparatus. Officers for the Russian army were recruited from the nobility. While cherishing the rights and privileges of noble landowners, Tsarism did not abandon the mercantile estate without its favors, protected the property of the capitalists and the regime of capitalist exploitation. At the same time, Tsarism grossly violated the interests of the working masses, which were the so-called taxation estates. They did not have any rights, but had to perform numerous duties. It was these classes that bore on their shoulders the entire burden of state taxes, military service, the arbitrariness of bureaucrats, landlords and the bourgeoisie. In fact, there was no factory legislation in Russia. The peasants' injustice was particularly evident in the unrestrained arbitrariness of the police chiefs, the sergeants, the Zemstvo commanders who mocked them with impunity. The government of the serfs mercilessly suppressed the strikes of workers and peasants' unrest. Describing the Russian economy at the beginning of the 20th century, Lenin pointed out that in it, modern capitalist imperialism is braided, so to speak, by a particularly dense network of pre-capitalist relations. One, that in Russia at the same time there existed the most backward land ownership, the wildest villages, the most advanced industrial and financial capitalism. 2. The close intertwining of capitalist and feudal relations, which together formed the economic basis of Russian society, determined the peculiarity of the political superstructure, which consisted in the fact that a handful of feudal landlords, led by Nicholas II, was in power, in close alliance with the magnates of financial capital. 3. The yoke of imperialism in Russia merged with the despotism of Tsarism, giving imperialism military feudal features. To this we should add that Russia, being an imperialist state, was at the same time in serious economic and political dependence on a number of Western European countries. As a result of the anti-national policy pursued by the Tsarist government during the period of 1. Lenin. Works, Volume 22, p. 246. Ist. 4th. 2. Lenin. Works, Volume 13, p. 406. 3. Lenin. Works, Volume 25, p. 111. The last third of the XX century, the investment of English, Belgian, French, German and other bankers in the Russian industry has steadily increased. So, if in 1870 the total amount of foreign capital in joint stock enterprises of Russia was 26.5 million rubles, in 1880 it reached 97.9 million, in 1890, 214.7 million, and in 1900, 911 million rubles. The British, French, Belgian, German capitalists took over the dominant position in the coal industry, in machine building, and in metallurgy. They felt themselves as full-fledged masters in such important industrial regions of Russia as Krivoy Rog, Donbass, and Baku. Having seized key positions in the Russian economy, foreign capitalists exerted a decisive influence on the character of the foreign and domestic policies of the Tsarist government. Consequently, Tsarism was the defender of interests not only of the feudal landlords and the bourgeoisie of Russia, but also of foreign capitalists. The imperialist states of Western Europe used Russia's economic dependence in their own interests, forcing the Tsarist government to pursue a foreign policy that suited them. In the world system of imperialism, Russia played a secondary, subordinate role. Tsarism was the watchdog of imperialism in the east of Europe. It helped foreign capitalists to extract fabulous profits as a result of the monstrous exploitation of the Russian, Ukrainian and other peoples of Russia. He was an agent of Western imperialism for driving out hundreds of millions of rubles from the population as interest on loans. The imperialist states of Western Europe competed, struggling to establish the greatest possible influence on Russia, in order to use its gigantic resources to their advantage. Consequently, in Russia the interests of a number of states collided, which turned it into a key point of the contradictions of the entire world system of imperialism. The violence of numerous remnants of serfdom, the cruel regime of capitalist exploitation, national oppression, and Russia's heavy dependence on foreign capital all inevitably led to an exacerbation of class antagonisms in country. In Russia, in the era of imperialism, along with the contradictions inherent in bourgeois society, there were contradictions that arose in the feudal era. The conflict between the productive forces and production relations that arose under serfdom reached an exceptional acuteness by the beginning of the 20th century, because the productive forces, which had long been in conflict with the remnants of serfdom, had by this time collided with capitalist production relations. The law of the obligatory correspondence of production relations to the character of the productive forces already insistently demanded the replacement of bourgeois production relations by socialist ones. The acute conflict of the productive forces, not only with the remnants of serfdom, but also with bourgeois production relations, conditioned in Russia the existence of two social wars. One of them was an objective war between the proletariat and the peasantry against the Tsar and the landowners, for the destruction of large land ownership and all remnants of serfdom, and the other for the wiping out workers of town and country against the urban and rural bourgeoisie, for the abolition of capitalism. The peasants, who suffered brutally from the acute shortage of land, could not reconcile themselves to the existence of huge land-owning latifundia. Striving to seize the landed estates, peasants quite clearly expressed as far back as 1861. But then their fragmented speeches were suppressed by the government with ruthless cruelty. A few years later a new wave of peasant movement began to rise. Already in 1877 peasant unrest occurred in 11 provinces, in 1878, in 14, in 1879, in 29, in 1880, in 34 provinces of European Russia. By far not complete data, during the years 1881–1890 there were 541 excitement of the peasants. In the 90s, the wave of the peasant movement rose even higher. The seizure of huge land-owning latifundia, this was, in the final analysis, the goal of all peasant unrest. And this aspiration could not be broken by any repressions of Tsarism. In the course of the struggle against the landowners, the peasant came into collision with the entire autocratic system. Therefore, despite the naively monarchical illusions of the peasantry, his attacks against the landowners also inflicted blows on Tsarism. That is why the agrarian question throughout the post-reform period was, as Lenin put it, the nail of the entire social development of Russia. The revolutionary speeches of the peasantry began to acquire particular importance after the revolutionary Russian proletariat entered the arena of political struggle. His main cadres were formed in the post-reform period. By the end of the 1990s, the number of workers in large factories and plants, in the mining industry, and in the railways reached 2,272,000. Most industrial workers in Russia were concentrated in large enterprises. Thus, in enterprises with more than 500 workers, more than 50% of all industrial workers were concentrated, while in the United States only 33% of workers were in such enterprises. The high degree of concentration of the proletariat at large enterprises was extremely important, for it facilitated the unity and organization of the workers. The situation of the workers was extremely difficult. The continuous inflow of ruined peasants into the city, the growth of the army of the unemployed allowed the entrepreneurs to repair any arbitrariness over the workers. The working day lasted 12–14 hours. The overwhelming mass of workers received wages much lower than the subsistence minimum, and with the exception of the metal processing industry, it rarely exceeded 7–8 rubles per month. The workers lived in dirty and cramped barracks, they were maimed by illnesses, they died or were mutilated in enterprises where there was no labor protection. All this pushed the workers to fight the masters. With every decade, the revolutionary struggle of the workers took on an ever wider scope. If, according to incomplete data, about 40 strikes and disturbances among workers took place in the 1960s, in the 70s there were at least 220 strikes of workers, in the 1980s at least 446, and during only the first half of the 1990s, years, 232 strikes. In the mid-1990s, the liberation struggle of the working class entered a new phase of its development, closely related to the activity of the St. Petersburg Union of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class, created by Lenin, who for the first time in history implemented the combination of socialism with the workers' movement. From that time the proletarian period of the Russian liberation movement began. The unfolding of the mass labor movement prompted the creation of a genuinely Marxist party of the proletariat. The first rudiment of this party was the St. Petersburg Union of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class. Lenin, who was in charge of his work, carefully studied the experience of this first truly revolutionary organization of the working class and made full use of it in the struggle to create a revolutionary party of a new type. The struggle of Lenin for the creation of a new type of party was of gigantic, truly world historic significance. The extraordinary acuteness of class antagonisms in Russia, which became the nodal point of the contradictions of imperialism, the powerful upsurge of the liberation movement, embracing with every passing year a growing number of working people, the emergence of the very revolutionary party of a new type, and the emergence of Leninism, the Marxism of the era of imperialism. All this in the absence of serious revolutionary performances, working class in Western Europe, and the dominance of opportunism in the working class movement of Western European countries led to the move to Russia in the late XX century, the center of the world revolutionary movement. In view of the acute antagonism of the productive forces, not only with the remnants of serfdom, but also with bourgeois production relations, due to the presence in Russia of a modern proletariat led by a revolutionary party of a new type, the impending revolution could not stop at bourgeois democratic transformations, but due to objective conditions inevitably develop further, developing into a socialist revolution.